Hi, and welcome to our podcast on the Khalifa International Award for Early Learning. I'm Dr. Stephen Barnett, chair of the award committee, and I'm joined here today by Dr. Jana Fleming, another member of the award committee. Today we'll talk with you about the award, why it matters, its importance, and the criteria that the award committee uses to judge and select the winners. So let's start with why this matters. Jana, what's your perspective on why this award is important?
Steve, there are a few ways to look at that. One is, why is it important at a worldwide or international level? And then why is it important to the United Arab Emirates, who's supporting the award? I think internationally, there's, for decades, there's been such a focus on early childhood development and early childhood education in particular, and countries around the world really trying to understand what young children need, what people who are working with young children need in order to improve children's development, to ensure optimal development, et cetera. And so with this international focus on early childhood education more broadly, and there being so many practices all around the world and so much research going on, I think any entity really being involved in trying to promote top quality, high quality research, trying to encourage researchers to do more of good quality research, trying to encourage practitioners and others to engage in more innovative practices. Khalifa is really interested in just being a part of that environment. I think in terms of it being located or coming out of here in the UAE, the government has a really strong commitment to promoting early childhood development, promoting families, family cohesion, improving education more broadly. And so it just seems like a natural that the two would come together. The government would really decide to not just focus on early education here in the UAE, but also think about ways it might support early education and best practices and research on an international level.
I think that's so important because, as you know, there's a huge amount of information out there about research and practice. I think for policymakers, as well as for early childhood educators, it's hard to sort through that and figure out, well, what's the best? If we really want to invest in our kids in our country, wherever that is, and there are hundreds of millions of young children globally that could benefit from really harnessing better information. But I'm very sympathetic to government administrators, practitioners, and others trying to sort through. I think one of the things that makes this international focus so important is that, as you know, there's a huge amount of information out there for policymakers, for practitioners, not always accurate. It's hard to find your way through it and identify what is the best. What do we know from research, really, that can inform policy and practice? What is it that's the best practice out there for young children? I sympathize with government officials, early childhood educators trying to work their way through this vast flow of information and figure that out. And the Khalifa Award is at least one way to bring recognition, identification, find your way to some of the best on the planet in terms of research and practice. So let's talk a little bit about the criteria. There are 4 criteria for research, 4 criteria for practice. In many ways, they're similar. There are some key differences. The first one for both research and practice is innovativeness. Would you talk a little bit about what that means for the committee?
Yeah. What's interesting is how we define innovation and creativity, and what makes either research or practice kind of innovative in our context. And we're looking for initiatives that, or either whether research or practice, that really are people thinking outside the box. If it's a research project, it really is using the subject of it is something kind of different and unusual that's going to have an impact on young children and their parents, or practitioners. Or if it's a program that is having the same innovation and creative impact. And part of it is that it's something that we haven't seen before. and that it isn't simply if it's a practice innovative in your context. What happens with some applicants is they use in their home environment, where they happen to live, they'll implement a practice that's new to them and different for them, and they'll think that that's innovative. And it may be in their context, and that's really worthwhile for the award, for them, but it doesn't quite meet our criteria that it really is innovative at this broader global level. And that would be true for the research, the methodology. And so we're really looking at something that is just that we haven't seen it before. And it could have been done before, but done slightly differently. So the innovation is really simply shifting it a bit, shifting or changing some aspect of it, whether it's the research methodology or what you're looking at in the research, or whether it's the practice.
Yeah, I think that's important for people to understand that it's globally innovative, new, creative. And that, of course, ties into the second criterion, which is importance, because one of the things that makes it important, and it's interesting, the more I think about the four criteria, the more I realize they're not really independent.
No.
Right? Even though they're evaluated separately, they have equal weight, they are interdependent. So the creativity, innovativeness is part of what makes something important, but it's also important because of the ways in which those things matter. Jana, any insights that you would add to that?
Yeah. What comes to mind is people really thinking about what is important for young children and their growth and development in the context of these educational environments. And so the importance is really focused on this is going to have an impact on children, or it's relevant to early childhood development. That's one way we look at it. The other would be that it's important in the field. It's answering a question or solving an issue that we've been grappling with for decades and decades, or maybe just years in some cases, and that it really is going to have an impact. If this intervention, whether it's research or whether it's practice, is successful, it's going to have an impact on children that is important, their kind of trajectory, their outcomes, et cetera.
Yeah, I also think that the committee responds very favorably to applicants that are addressing problems in contexts or for populations that have been neglected in the past or simply are new. Yeah. There's a lot of research in the U.S., in Europe, increasingly in China. There are hundreds of millions of children in the developing world whose learning and development is not optimized.
Right.
There's a lot we could do for them, less research on what actually works for them, for their context. I think about issues of multilingualism. And this is a global issue. It's important here in the UAE. It's important everywhere. But a lot of different multilingual contexts, it's really different, I think, what would be best practice. And there's a big need for research. I would love to see more applicants in that area.
Yeah, I agree. And one thought I had just now is when you mentioned a few minutes ago that these criteria are not independent of one another, kind of innovation and importance. What comes to my mind is we've had a few applicants that end up not making it through the process where they've come up with a really interesting, innovative idea. And usually it's a practice, some intervention, but it really isn't very important. It's just sort of, I don't want to say wild and crazy. We haven't had anything wild and crazy, but just really unique and different. And it's like, well, this sounds great, and it actually is pretty cool, but it's not really that important to children's development or their educational trajectories.
Well, that's right.
Yeah.
And there are global concerns now about recovery in education after the pandemic. And so we really do want to see things that are important in terms of meaningful changes in children's early learning experiences and development. And that leads us then to issues about the criteria for, well, how do you figure that out? And for research, that's having a strong methodology. Would you want to set out some thoughts about what do we mean at the committee by strong methodology?
Yeah. This ends up being, I think, the one variable that is most challenging and is the reason why many of the applicants end up not making it to the final. They simply have not conducted really robust research methodologies, and it's hard to say. I'm not sure what else I can say about that, but we really are looking at, really robust approaches to measurement, and it can be both qualitative and quantitative. We're looking at, especially, well, I'll let you say more, Dr. Steve.
Well, I think that's right, Jana.
Yeah.
The next criterion that applies to both research and practice is impact.
Right.
And so the methodology is really key for figuring out, do you really have impact? And so having a strong basis for causal inference, for trust. If one of the goals of the award is to encourage governments to invest in strong, effective practices, policies, well, you have to have a basis for knowing that if you do this, it will actually have those results. And I find that people underestimate the rigor required in research as a basis for strong causal inferences, and causal inferences that generalize to a scale that matters, right? So you can see again how these things interact.
Yeah. And I'll say what, just in terms of not quite tips, but what things we'll find is, again, innovation criteria is met, the importance is met, and then with the research, we'll find that it's a very small sample size. It may be one classroom, for example, or a school with end up, 15 or 20 children are impacted by the intervention. And so it can pass all the criteria, and the research can be relatively solid, but it's not at a scale. 15 children having a small difference in test scores or whatever the variables are we're measuring isn't really at the level we want here. And so we want much more research methodologies that are robust, and then we want slightly larger samples to show that that this intervention really is having an impact on that's changing a trajectory for children, as you mentioned before, in terms of their education. The same ends up being true for practice. I think what we have that's really different about the practice applications are people who are developing the practices who are not researchers. And so they really don't have those research skills. And so I think we can encourage people to definitely, if you're developing a practice, while you're doing that, begin either learning more about research yourself or hook up with a researcher who can help you design that practice in a way and identify issues and questions you want to investigate during the research so you can actually answer them and conduct that research. What we'll often get are people who are simply submitting satisfaction surveys as evidence that this has had an impact. Parents are more satisfied, children are more satisfied, or again, just some modest changes in children's maybe scores or their behavior. Again, we need something much more robust than that.
And that takes us into this criterion of impact, right? And for programs, practices, curriculum, they really do need to have, if they don't have this themselves, which is often the case, some kind of partner that's conducted a rigorous evaluation to demonstrate impact. It's not just, we did this and we think these things happened. Right? Everybody who develops a new program or practice is a true believer, right? You wouldn't want it to be otherwise if the originators, developers weren't believers. That would really be a problem. But that's not enough, right? So what kind of evaluation, even independent evaluation, has provided evidence of impact? That's something that we look at. And again, it's not 15 kids in one little place, right? It's evidence of impact that could be at scale. Now, that can be tricky, I think. I'd be interested to see what you think about this. For me, we don't want to rule out things that are promising.
Right.
Right? That it's not established that this has already produced great benefits at scale, but there's a real promise it could do that. But it has to be a promise based on some kind of evidence that there's really important change in practice, in children's experiences, ideally, but not necessarily, in learning and development, so that you could see there's some empirical basis for making a case for the promise.
Right. And often that ends up being evidenced in some kind of publication. And for research, it could be a journal or an article or something more formal at that level. But for the practice also, we'll find, a lot of practice ends up being supported either by government or philanthropy. And as a result of that, there's a reporting out on what the benefits were, what the outcomes were, what the impact was, and in particular policy implications. And so evidence of impact can come to us in lots of ways, but often it is through providing publications, reports from foundations, reports from a funder, reports from the government, et cetera.
Yeah. And of course, then we have one more criterion that is related, as we keep saying, to these others for program or practice, and that's feasibility, sustainability.
Yeah.
How does the committee evaluate that in your experience?
A key element is our looking at the cost, and that the intervention is costed out. That we have some sense of what it costs to develop it, to implement it, and what it would cost to replicate it. Because again, if it's going to have an impact in one environment, we want to make sure it has impacts in other environments, which is the importance of the research component. That gives us some confidence that it worked in this situation or these couple of situations, it can work beyond that. But if someone has just millions and millions and millions of whatever currency it is, and they spent it on an intervention, and it's just not possible that most other entities or countries or municipalities are going to have that kind of money, then it becomes not as relevant for the Khalifa Award. I mean, it can still be a worthwhile intervention, but if it's really uber costly, then it's outside the realm of it being replicable and sustainable over time and just really feasible. So that feasibility and sustainability, one core element of that is the cost, and the applicant being able to identify what those costs are, and determining that those really are feasible for scaling up and implementing more broadly.
As an economist, I naturally think about this in terms of costs and benefits.
Yeah.
The benefits address the importance, and the cost is the feasibility, sustainability, or at least one element of that. And from a policy government perspective, they're equally important, right? You're looking at what's the net benefit, what do we get for what we put in, and yet if I look across the research, we have orders of magnitude more research on benefits than we do on cost. And yet the cost part isn't that hard to get right. It just somehow doesn't get done.
Yeah.
And again, in looking at applicants for the Khalifa Award, I see so often the cost part isn't addressed, but it'd be relatively easy to do that, to give. If you don't have dollars or some other currency expended on it, you have to be able to provide for something to be feasible, a roadmap to how would you do this, right? To take us back a little bit on if you can set out, this is what you need to do to take this to scale, to replicate what we did and hopefully get the same kinds of results that we were getting, then you have to have a map of the resources required. And if you have that, you really have cost.
Yeah.
So even if you can't put a currency value on those, if you specify the resources that are required in terms of personnel and training and time, how long it takes to get something up to speed. Is there coaching required for this? Those kinds of details are really necessary to understand whether this is feasible, sustainable. And that's really what we mean by cost, more than just tell us, oh, it was $1,000 per child.
Right.
Well, that's not as informative, actually, as knowing, but what are the exact resources that we need to require? Because how much those cost in dollars or currency is going to differ depending on the on where it's implemented.
And that's really important, given the international context of the Khalifa Award in early learning, that, as you pointed out, the cost isn't simply a lump sum at the end. It really is articulated by the different cost categories or categories of cost, whether it's personnel, materials, training, et cetera, so that people in other countries can then determine, okay, these are the elements that are required, and we can then attribute a dollar amount or money amount, monetary value to each of those elements so that we can then figure out whether it's feasible for us. And so that was very important to point that out. And again, for reasons we haven't quite yet figured out, very few of the applicants end up providing that information, even at the lump sum level, but surely not the detail. And as you pointed out, since someone's going through that, they've attributed cost already because they've actually implemented the initiative. They should be able to do that relatively simply, and so we do encourage people to pay more attention to that.
It reminds me that the other thing that's connected to that in terms of feasibility and sustainability is what are the conditions under which the developers think it works, right? Because there are the program features that you need to implement, but then there may be things that need to be present in the context that make it important, that affect the impact, that, whether if this is a program that addresses, a key element is addressing malnutrition, if children aren't malnourished, that's not a context in which you expect to get benefits. If it depends on having highly trained, very professional teacher workforce, then a policymaker has to think about, well, do we have that? Yeah. If we don't have that, is it possible to create it in order to implement this? So that kind of information about what are the contextual factors, I think also contributes to making an application more interesting, elevating it to the level of best in the world.
I agree, and I would say that information is usually provided either in an introductory paragraph in the beginning or in the description about the importance. And the person is not just contextualizing it in terms of their own environment, why this is important to us here now, but why it's important more broadly to the field as well. And so, but that context is very important, again, to help the committee assess better what the benefit is.
So Jana, as we wrap up, any final tips you want to add or things you want to put additional emphasis on?
Sure. Really, there are just two. One, it's really important for the applicants to understand that each criterion is independent and that we're scoring each of them equally. And so if you don't want to just sort of decide I'm going to put less effort in innovation than I do in importance, and it's not going to make a difference. It actually does. And so the applicants should put equal importance to equal weight to each of the four criteria. And the other is, as we've mentioned already, applicants tend to not have sufficiently robust research. And so really pay attention to that. And if you don't have the robust research now, maybe just wait a year and just figure out how you can get the resources to conduct the research that really is necessary to prove the kind of impact that the initiative is having or the research is having.
Oh, thanks, Jana. And thanks to you for joining us for this video. I'll just add, there's a lot of information on the Khalifa International Award for Early Learning website. Read it carefully. There are very clear instructions. There are FAQs. There's another video that really walks you through every step of the process. Not just the judging criteria, but all of the criteria for the mechanics of the award. Everything you need to know. There's audio, there's video, and of course, you can email the Khalifa Award for further information. Thank you.